Hey guys, Razor here back again with another video. And before I begin this video, I just wanted to thank you guys for all the support on my other videos. I messed up the Ganyu video quite a bit, and it was definitely not one of my best takes ever, but I promise to do better on this video. And also, I wanted to thank you guys for the 1.4k subscribers. I planned to only hit 800 before the end of the new year, but I had no idea my simple, small albedo guide would end up getting viewed so many times. I really appreciate the support. And again, if you like this video, leaving a like, a comment, or a subscription would greatly be appreciated, as it helps my video show up better due to how YouTube's algorithm works. Now let's get back to the main content. So just a quick disclaimer about these preparation guides. The purpose of these guides is to evaluate a character based off current information and how to best use them and prepare for their release with good teammates and weapons in advance, so you don't have to possibly spend the next 4 to 6 weeks working on the character when you could just play them very shortly after their release. Today, I'll be going to Xiao and all the information about him as well as my own thoughts and opinions in regards to his stats, talents, weapons, artifacts, constellations, and finally some teammates that could work well with his playstyle. So without further ado, let's get started. So going into Xiao's stats, he actually has very similar base stats to Diluc, with Xiao having a bit higher defense and base attack, but a little less HP than Diluc. Both units share the same Ascension stat, which increases as you ascend the character, except for when you unlock their 2 passive abilities. Both units have the crit rate stat increased as you ascend them, and both cap to a max of 24.2% crit rate when you ascend them to their final ascension. Also, keep in mind that while Xiao requires the same gems as any other character, he will require an entirely new Ascension boss material, which can only be farmed in the 1.3 patch. So farming for his Ascensions pre-release is probably not the best idea. However, if you do plan on getting Hu Tao as well, you could probably farm the gemstones in advance and simply farm for Hu Tao's materials on the Pyro boss, since both bosses will drop the same elite boss material to ascend both, as you will be roadblocked by the gemstones more than the boss materials. Xiao will also require Genshin flowers for his local specialty, along with slime materials, as well as a decent chunk of Mora to get his ascensions and his levels. Now that we covered his stats, as well as some of the materials you will need to ascend him, let's dive into his talents. So before we dive into Xiao's talents, I wanted to go into what types of materials are needed to get Xiao's talents leveled up, so you could farm those in advance. Xiao will require Books of Prosperity, which can be farmed in the Leeway book domain on Mondays, Thursdays, and Sundays, and will also require slime materials, and for his later levels, he will require the Shadow of the Warriors for those talent levels, which can be obtained from the Child Weekly boss fight randomly. Now going into his actual talents, starting off with his first talent, which is just his auto attack. So for his normal attack, very similar to every other polearm user in the game, Xiao performs 6 auto attacks with a spear, and for his charge attack and plunge attack are pretty much just very similar to the other spear users as well. So for Xiao's elemental skill, Xiao will quickly lunge forward and deal Anemo damage to any enemy that he hits during this lunge. While the scaling is fairly high for an elemental skill at 455% at level 10, which is actually similar in skill damage percentage to Venti's, but keep in mind that it does have a fairly long cooldown, with it being 10 seconds. On the other hand though, you actually get 2 of these charges, very similar to how Klee works normally, but if you have his Constellation 1 ability, then you will actually end up getting 3 of these charges instead. Also, not necessarily for direct damage, but you can possibly use this skill as an evasion maneuver if you wanted to somehow dodge something like an AoE attack and simply needed a boost in your movement. I'm not entirely sure if this skill has any iframes associated with it, but it would be nice if it did nonetheless. So moving on to Xiao's Elemental Burst, which is very similar to Razor's, Xiao will transform into his Conqueror of Demons form and gains a variety of effects, which are boosted attack speed and mobility, increased normal attack, charge attack, and plunge attack damage, as well as an Anemo infusion to all of the 3 damages, normal attack, charge attack, and plunge. And this infusion cannot be removed by any other ability, such as Bennett's Constellation 6 ability or Chongyung's elemental skill. However, during the duration of Xiao's burst, he will continually lose his HP. The effects of this burst end when A, Xiao dies, B, he's swapped in for another character, or C, the duration of the burst ends. Another thing very unique about this burst is that it's the very first 70 cost burst, which is going to be hard to regain back, but not necessarily as hard as an 80 cost burst. So either having an Anemo character in your party to help generate Anemo particles, or building more energy recharge on Xiao himself will definitely be needed to consistently get this burst back online again. In terms of what talent to prioritize when leveling, I would first work on Xiao's auto attack and his elemental burst fairly evenly, since his burst actually augments the damage done by his auto attacks as a damage bonus. So the auto attack is actually the skill modifier in terms of the damage formula, and the burst provides a big damage bonus modifier, which is stacked additively with any sort of elemental damage that Xiao has on him. For example, your cup or from the Venerer artifact set. Then I would focus on his elemental skill last, since Xiao really is going to rely on his auto attacks while in his burst form to deal a good majority of his damage. So going into his passives, the first passive being Conqueror of Evil, Tamer of Demons, which essentially increases the damage dealt to enemies the longer Xiao maintains his elemental burst form, starting off at 5% and increasing by 5% every 3 seconds for a maximum of 25%. This bonus is stacked additively with your burst damage bonus, so the effect will be nice, but not as effective as you may think at first. The passive is pretty much encourages players to play more of an aggressive playstyle with Xiao's burst, and also to take full advantage of it, it will require players to have some source of external passive healing on their team, such as Bennett and Jean, as opposed to someone maybe like Barbara, since the healing she provides from her skill isn't too fantastic without her being active on the field, which is not necessarily what we want. But we'll talk about that during the teammate section of the video. So moving on to Xiao's second combat passive, Dissolution Aeon Heaven Fall. This increases the damage of his elemental skill by 15% from subsequent uses of the skill, which is kind of similar to how Diluc elemental skill works. However, you do have a longer grace period to use the effect, lasting up to 7 seconds. So you want to use the skill pretty fast after the first use if you plan on maximizing Xiao's damage in the shortest time possible. However, you can also space out the skill to maximize the effect since it lasts for 7 seconds, and using the skill will refresh the duration. So you can allow yourself to deal more damage over a longer period. However, you'll have to micromanage the duration of this ability to maintain the effects as high as possible. If you have his Constellation 1 ability, which provides 3 stacks to his elemental skill instead of 2, you can compound this effect a lot easier. So moving on to Xiao's Overworld passive, it just simply decreases the climbing stamina by 20% and fall damage by 50%. Which is actually insanely helpful since Liyue is full of annoying mountains to climb and essentially gives you a boost in stamina for climbing until we unlock Inazuma and other regions which can boost our stamina gauge further. Now that we finished going into his talents, let's take a look at some of the best weapons that we could possibly give Xiao as both a whale and a free-to-play or cheap-to-play player. So moving on to weapon choices for Xiao. So starting off with the current 5-star weapons, which are the Jade Spear and the Skyward Spine, I would actually say that both are about just the same in terms of their power level. While the Jade Spear provides more crit rate and increase to your attack and damage as you hit enemies, the Skyward Spine actually provides increased attack speed, which is fairly rare of an ability to get, as well as some decent crit rate and energy recharge, which will greatly help Xiao obtain his burst again, as it costs more than most of the DPS bursts in the entire game. Especially if you have refinement on the spine, I would actually recommend the Skyward Spine over the Jade Spear. However, both are really close and providing Xiao with immense value for what he'll end up doing, which is just providing solid DPS. Hey guys, Razor here back again with a quick update. So that 5-star weapon just got added to Honey today as of January 4th, 2021. It is called the Staff of Homa. It does have a crit damage percentage, and the crit damage scaling is insane at 66.2%. This obviously is going to probably get nerfed, but that'd be insane because this is pretty much the same amount as an artifact for crit damage. And the effect of it is also different. And what it actually does is it increases the HP. This was actually the same as what I heard. And as well as it gives you an attack bonus based off a percentage of your max HP. Your max HP is dependent on your artifacts, not just the base, but considering your flower, any substats, any sort of main stat artifacts you have with HP, this counts. Really insane for Hu Tao, really insane for Zhongli. I think it's a pretty decent weapon for Xiao because it the crit damage complements very well with his crit rate on his substat. as well as the attack bonus is not as bad as you think, and his base HP is not terrible. It's not obviously great as someone like Zhongli and Hu Tao, but it's there. It's pretty decent. So he'll be able to get a solid attack bonus out of this, and it's some very solid crit damage. I don't think it's as good as for Xiao as possibly a Skyward Spine and the Jade Spear, but I do think it's better. It is better than the 4 stars in my opinion. The HP that you lose on Xiao's burst is a percentage of his max HPs, but keep in mind that HP percent is still solid because 50% of an HP that's much higher, of a max HP that's much higher, is going to be a lot better than an HP that's 50% of an HP that's a lot lower. So just keep that in mind. The HP does help, and it will more HP will help you out with this weapon as well. So it wouldn't be terrible on the substat. I do talk about it in the artifact section, but it's not as important, but it's still nicer to have, especially when you're losing HP with Xiao. It will not actually affect the passive too much, but it'll still be decent. But then, just a quick update. Just want to let you guys know with this new weapon, and I'll see you guys back in the video. In terms of 4-star weapons, the Deathmatch and the Black Cliff Pole offer the best value. In my opinion, I think the Black Cliff Pole is better since you're already getting crit rate from his Ascension stat, but you could honestly take either one and be fine overall. Going down from there, we have the Favonius Lance, which is actually really solid as it helps your team generate more burst, as well as himself giving him more energy recharge, which allows him to spam back into his elemental burst again, provided that you have enough healing to maintain him, which is not too hard given that the energy provided by the Favonius from the effect is neutral, which generates more energy to the team than a specific elemental particle. Going now into pure craftable weapons for free-to-play players, I would actually recommend building the prototype Grudge, or if you go by the new name, prototype Starglitter, which I think is better than the Crescent Pike for Xiao, since you're not really going to take advantage of the physical bonuses provided by the Pike, since the good chunk of Xiao's damage will be from his burst, which already infuses him with Anemo, so you cannot do physical damage. The effect also combines nicely into his kit, into providing more damage by allowing him to hit harder on his auto attacks after usage of his elemental skill. Also, the 2 stacks on this weapon effect pair extremely well with Xiao's elemental skill, which also has 2 stacks on it. Overall, for the 4-star weapon category, that's not either the Deathmatch or the Black Cliff Pole, I would recommend the Grudge, or in the new name, the Starglitter, over the Favonius, but both are still fairly good to run for Xiao. So now that we finished going over Xiao's weapon choices, let's move into the biggest time sink for getting him up, which will be your artifacts. So going into Xiao's artifacts, there are a couple different ways you can build him, each with their own potential upsides and downsides, which I will explain. Overall, I think both builds are fine. It's just up to you on which part you like playing more. The main and substats are pretty much going to stay the same, so the only real defining factor is the set, which again is probably the least important part when it comes to building artifacts on your characters, which I personally prioritize as main stat over substat over your set. So moving on to the first build, I would recommend a 2-piece set of Verdicent Venerer and a 2-piece set of Gladiator's Triumph. This provides a mix of providing solid attack for Xiao, along with providing him with Anemo damage bonus, which can pair well with his elemental skill and his burst. The downside of using these 2 sets is that you're basically doing a jack of all trades and not really specializing in anything in particular, but it allows you the freedom of doing more charge attacks and plunges as opposed to the second build I'll talk about. So the second build I would recommend would be a 4-piece set of Gladiators, since it would boost your normal attack damage by 35%, as well as increasing your attack by 18%. However, keep in mind that it only applies to your normal attacks and not your plunge attacks or your charge attacks. So if you intend to plunge attack a lot with Xiao, you really won't get any of the bonuses, which really restricts how you would use Xiao, especially in his burst form. Another big drawback is that getting 4 solid pieces of Gladiators is insanely tough, only dropping from Spiral Abyss rewards, which can only occur 2 times a month, or getting lucky on your weekly boss drops or your elite boss drops. At AR 55, you're only guaranteed 1 5-star artifact from the elite bosses, such as a Pyroregisfine or the Electrohypostasis, for example. But again, getting the drop you want is still extremely rare. So moving on to some sets that I would not recommend are first the 4-piece Venerer set, which simply increases your swirl damage and reduces the elemental resistance of other elements, which doesn't actually work really well at all with Xiao, as you won't get good damage off the swirl usually, and reducing the resistance of other elements besides Anemo when we have Anemo as our main DPS is kind of a bit worthless. Another set that I would not recommend using would be the Noblesse set, since the burst provides a damage bonus and not actual damage, making the effect 100% useless. Going into main stats you're looking for on your artifacts, for your hat, I would recommend crit rate or crit damage. Whichever one you pick really depends on your weapon and your artifacts, but ideally you'll want to balance out your crit rate and damage again in the 1-to-2 ratio. So if you're low on crit damage, picking the crit rate, you should pick the crit damage hat, sorry. However, if you're low on rate, you should pick the crit rate hat. So again, if you're low on crit damage, pick the crit damage hat. If you're low on crit rate, pick the crit rate hat to balance out those ratios. Most likely though, you'll be low on crit damage since Xiao already gains a good amount of rate from his ascensions. So for your timepiece, I would actually recommend going energy recharge if you didn't pick an energy recharge main stat weapon, as it will make his burst much easier to charge in order to get his DPS up and running well. If you did pick an energy recharge weapon, instead I would recommend going an attack percent timepiece to boost his overall damage. If you're lacking any good energy recharge timepieces and lack an energy recharge weapon, then going attack is just fine. Just keep in mind that you should try to aim for good energy recharge substats as opposed to attack. Finally, going into our cup, easily I would pick an Anemo damage bonus cup. However, since I know Anemo damage bonus cups are extremely hard to come by, if you're lacking them, then attack percent is still solid, as the damage bonuses provided by the Anemo cup will scale additively with the damage bonuses from his elemental burst, for example, as well as a gladiator possibly. So going into the substats, I would prioritize crit rate and crit damage first, then focus on attack if you have sufficient energy recharge. However, if you didn't pick energy recharge on your timepiece or weapon, I would strongly recommend trying to go for that energy recharge on those subs instead of attack more, since you really wanted to take advantage of his elemental burst. Finally, going HP percent isn't terrible, as gaining more HP stats allow you to maintain your burst for a longer period of time and benefit more from his passive, which scales his damage the longer you can maintain this elemental burst. So again, for your substats, crit rate, crit damage, and recharge mostly, then attack, and then finally HP percentage. So that was definitely a lot of info, but probably the most important info out of this whole guide. So hopefully that was able to help you out. So next, let's talk about the whale section of this video, which will be talking about Xiao's Constellations. So before I begin talking about Xiao's Constellations, I just want to start off this section by saying that you don't need Constellations on Xiao, or pretty much any character for that matter, to get fun value and out of the character. My build should pretty much remain constant no matter what constellation you go for on Xiao, but I do have to admit, obviously, that his constellations will end up increasing his DPS, obviously, due to leveling on his skills and possible utility on the battlefield. So without further ado, let's dive into talking about Xiao's constellations effects and break them down one by one. So starting off with Xiao's first constellation, this simply allows him to hold 3 instead of 2 charges on his elemental skill. Obviously, this will allow him to do more damage out of the skill, but it will also allow him to better use the effect of his second combat passive, which increases the damage of subsequent elemental procs on him within a short time frame. Overall, this is pretty good value, and if you wanted to stop here as a Dolphin player, it'd be totally good. In my opinion, it's actually one of his best constellation abilities. So moving on to Xiao's second constellation ability, this will increase his energy recharge by 25%. However, it would only increase it by 25% when he's not the active character on the field. Overall, I think this constellation is actually going to be fairly low value, since you'll ideally want Xiao on the field a lot of the time to deal a majority of your damage. It will also help get his burst back online faster, but you can mitigate the effect of this constellation through something as a energy recharge weapon or having solid energy recharge on your artifacts to mitigate it. So moving on to Xiao's third constellation, this will simply increase the level of his elemental skill by 3 levels, just provides solid value, allowing him to either deal more damage or require less investment when it comes to leveling his skills, as compared to a non-Constellation 3 player. So moving on to Xiao's fourth constellation, this will increase Xiao's defense by 100% when his HP goes below 50%. Honestly, when I get to talking about teammates for Xiao, I actually think the value presented by this is not so great as originally thought of. But don't get me wrong though, it will definitely allow him to be more offensive, especially during the burst, since your defense will make you much more tanky. However, you can just equip him with a Jade Shield from Zhongli or some other shield, which can provide to help mitigate this effect for the entire effect of this constellation. Overall, with some good teammates, especially considering the buffs to Geo Shields and Zhongli with his new Jade Shield passive, I think this constellation is actually a little bit fairly low value. So moving on to Xiao's fifth constellation, it's similar to his third, where it just simply increases the level of his elemental burst by 3 levels, allowing him to either do more damage or require less investment to get working. It's just a solid constellation, nothing much to say here. So finally, moving on to Xiao's sixth constellation, this will allow you to regain a charge of his elemental skill if you plunge attack 2 enemies during your elemental burst. And for the next second of this effect, you can ignore the cooldown of this ability, allowing you to use his elemental skill immediately. This obviously will make his plunge attacks a lot better for damage, so if you end up giving him a 4-piece gladiator set, it's not going to be as great for you. Similarly, if you happen to pair Xiao up with Xingqiu, because the swords on Xingqiu actually pair with his with Xiao's normal attack, due to how Xingqiu's elemental burst and how that works. So overall, the effect is a bit overrated in my opinion, and in my opinion, overall, it's definitely not worth spending your money on just for this effect. So now that we got the whale section out of the way, let's go back and talk about some of the best teammates that we can pair for Xiao. So talking about good teammates that work well with Xiao having a transformative burst, ideally some of the best characters you can place with Xiao are allies that have lingering effects that last when they're not the active character in combat. The best of these being Fischl and Xingqiu. If you don't have either Constellation 6, it'd be probably better to run Xingqiu, as the bird will not hit as frequently or as long as the value of Xingqiu's swords during his elemental burst ability. However, if you do have Fischl's Constellation 6 ability, I would actually suggest her instead over Xingqiu, since the bird's attack will go in rhythm with Xiao's attacks, which will gain speed from his elemental burst ability. Also, Xingqiu's swords on his burst trigger from normal attacks, so it'd restrict how you would play Xiao, similarly to running the 4-piece Glad. But having both the Glad and the Xingqiu build together would still be pretty dang solid. Albedo would also provide solid damage value, however keep in mind that no reactions work with Anemo combined with Geo and vice versa, so all it provides is more damage unless you have the Constellation 4 Albedo ability, which provides increased damage to your plunge attacks while inside the Solar Isotoma field on his elemental skill. For a possible third team member, I would actually recommend someone with a shield that can prevent Xiao from getting interrupted during his burst, especially if you don't have his Constellation 4 ability, as well as just generally helping him tank and tank some of the damage that he'll end up having. The best candidate for this will be Zhongli, as his new buffs are going to provide both insane offensive and defensive capabilities with the Jade Shield, which helps Xiao's kit work better, reducing resistance boost Xiao's damage by a lot, to be precise around 18% on most enemies in the game. However, a more budget-friendly option would probably be someone like Noelle, who provides good healing, as well as having a pretty beefy shield with the upcoming Geo Shield buff. Finally, I would 1000% recommend bringing a solid healer that can provide quick healing when going back into your elemental burst. The best candidates, in my opinion, would be Jean, but Bennett is also an extremely solid choice. Again, for a more budget-friendly option for those types of players, I would recommend someone like Barbara in this slot, since she would provide good value in her burst, getting Xiao fully healed, as well as providing some decent healing over time with her elemental skill. So 2 different teams I would recommend would be, so starting off with our whale team, which is probably the team I would use when I use him when I will end up using him, which is Xiao, who will be our primary damage dealer, Albedo, who provides solid sub DPS value in his Constellation 4 ability for extra plunge damage, Zhongli, which will provide insane defensive value and offensive capabilities with his Jade Shield buff and 1.3, and finally Jean for her top tier healing and from the effects of her Constellation 2 and Constellation 4 abilities, which will make Xiao deal more damage and move faster, providing insane value. Keep in mind that while this team doesn't have any real reactions, they do have the ability to spam bursts and keep units active, as well as the resonance effects, which will increase damage bonuses, as well as providing better movement and cooldown options. And then next, moving on to a cheap to play or free to play team, I'd recommend something like Xiao, Jean, or Bennett, Qingqiu or Fischl, and Zhongli or Noelle as our 4th slot. So specifically, if you have a Constellation 6 Fischl, I would use her over Qingqiu instead. And if you don't have Zhongli, I would recommend Noelle as a possible replacement. I would also recommend Jean as the primary healer in this comp, even at C0, since her heal and synergy with Anemo is extremely good value. However, if you're missing Jean, Bennett can also act as our main healer and support in this case, and to maintain Xiao's burst. You'll also want to stay in Bennett's field as long as possible to maintain the buff, as well as the healing. Qingqiu and Fischl will provide solid sub DPS value with our Xiao, and Zhongli will provide a solid defensive and offensive support again with the use of his Jade Shield and his CC abilities from his Petrify effect on the Elemental Burst. If you don't have Zhongli, again, Noelle's a solid option for the Geo Shield. However, if you feel that your Bennett and Qingqiu already provide you with enough defensive options, then I recommend to possibly place a sub DPS unit like Fischl or Qingqiu, whichever one you didn't pick, or possibly a sub DPS to swap into like Kaya or possibly Beto, which can offer both solid DPS and support options in their abilities. So going into my final thoughts on Xiao, I think he's going to be a great Anemo DPS carry, even if he got nerfed from beta, since he looked way too strong during CBT2. While I'm not sure if he'll end up a top tier DPS like Child, he will end up right now serving as a solid A tier character until his release. Again, keep in mind that things can change with Xiao between this video's release and the release of 1.3 in which he actually comes out, so he could get further changes. And again, I will do my best, however, to keep you guys updated in a pinned comment with any changes to his kit, as well as my thoughts on such changes. And that's going to be it for the Xiao prep guide. Thank you guys for watching again, and if you like the information, leaving a like, as well as a nice and funny comment, and hitting that subscribe button with the notification icon would really help me out. Let me know if you guys want to see a possible Hu Tao preparation guide by liking this video, as I have already prepared a quite juicy team comp prepared for her. And if you want to catch me live, sorry, I stream pretty regularly on my Twitch channel, which will be linked down below in the description. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and have an awesome day. Laters.